Have you ever wanted to share a spreadsheet or dashboard with someone, but you're afraid to share the real data because of privacy issues? When I create spreadsheets and dashboards, I'm often asked to share these with other teachers. However, I can't because of the real data. So, in this situation, I need to create a sample data set that still maintains the integrity of the actual data. So in this video, I'm going to show you how you can create a sample data set while still maintaining the integrity of the data. So here I have a spreadsheet of some data that could be actual data used in a classroom or in a school. And this is a student roster data. So we have things like student ID numbers, names, photographs, teacher information, email addresses, citizenship and dates of birth, and there are some other key factors over here as well. So just some general demographic data about a class or a school. Now I have my names here, and I have school names, and these are all things called identifiers that we don't want other people to see. So what we can do is we can create a sample data set from this, yet still maintain the integrity of our data. Now, there are lots of ways that you can do this. I'm going to show you the way that I do this, and you can see if you can apply it to your own work later on. So the first thing that I do is I want to make sure that I don't do anything with the actual data. I don't want to adjust that. So if you've imported it from a CSV file or from somewhere else, then of course you can go ahead and manipulate that. And for the sake of this tutorial, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here to the actual data tab, and I'm going to duplicate this tab. And I will rename this to sample data so that I know which one I am working with. Now with my sample data set, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look for all of the identifiers, the things that I want to change. So I know student ID I'm going to have to change, student name, and what I'm doing is I'm holding down the command key as I click. The photos, you can tell those are already not original photos, so I'm just going to leave those as they are for now. I'm going to change the teacher name, the school name as an identifier, email addresses, and we'll stick with date of birth. So those are the things that I'm going to be going through and changing. And just to remind myself, I will come in here and I will give it a color there. That way I know that that's the original data, and then I will adjust it. So the first thing that I will start with is the student ID number. And I'm going to start with the student ID number. So what I like to do is I'll click on column A where student ID is, and I'm going to right click or control click, and I will go to insert one right. I want to add a column here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this to something else. Now there are a couple of different ways that you can do this. One of the easiest ways is by simply choosing a different number range and typing that in. So I can go ahead and say, for example, I want to start with a number that is a 6-digit number, but I want it to start with the 200,000s instead of 100,000. So I could just type that in, and then I can go down and type the next one that I would want in my sequence. After I've done that, if I hover over and highlight those two rows, I can adjust my cursor so that it's hovering over the box there and turns into a crosshair, and I can just drag that down, and that will continue to repeat the pattern and fill it all the way in. Another thing that I can do instead, since I have data going all the way down the side here, and I've got about 300 rows of data, instead of dragging all the way down, if I hover till I get the crosshairs and I double click with my mouse button, it will fill that in for me. All right. If you have a certain number that you want, and you want to keep all your numbers in between those numbers, you can also do a couple of different things. Another option, if you're curious, is to use the sequence function. So if you type in equals sequence, what this does is it asks you, okay, it'll go ahead and pull up some numbers for you, and it asks you for how many rows, how many columns, what's the start number, and the step. The step is the increment. So let's take a look at this. So how many rows do I want? Well, I've got, if I scroll to the bottom of my data, 304 minus our header, so 303 rows. And how many columns? I only have one column. I wanted to fill this one column. What number do I want to start with? I'm going to go ahead and just pick that number there. You can pick whatever number you want. And then how do I want them to increase? If you want them just to go up by ones, you can type 1. If you want them to count by 5s, you would type 5. By 10s, you would put in a 10, and so on. I'm just going to go ahead and put in a 1 for this. Close parentheses and press return, and you'll see it gives me the same information. All right, so it puts all those numbers in, and that's re-identified my student ID numbers. The next thing we'll take a look at is student names. So I have my real names here, and depending on what I'm doing, if I need to make a data set really quickly, I'll go ahead and insert a column right. And what I can do is, instead of using a student name, I will just type in the word student and then put in an identifier. So for example, I'll put in the last 3 digits of this new ID number. So I might put in 200. And then down here I put in student 201, for example. Now, because I've done my student ID numbers in sequential order, I'll just take this and I can double click here and it will fill that in for me all the way down. Now, if you wanted to do something where you wanted real names, so you want it to look like real names like this, but you don't want it to be the actual name, there's a way that you can do that. And what I do is I go to a website that's called Random Name Generator. So Random Name Generator, and I'll put the link in the description below. Random Name Generator is a site where you can go and create a list of random names, and these are all names, if you see here, that are based on the database from the US Census. What I like to do is come up here and I'll choose, for this sake, I'll choose 100, and I end up deciding I want my males to remain the same and my females to remain the same. That's my data integrity there. So I will go ahead and just choose one category. For now, I'll just choose male, and I'll say I want 100 male names. Then I click on Generate Random Names, and I have my list of names here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and highlight and scroll, and I'm pressing Command-C to copy those names. I'll go back to my data set here, and where I put my student names, if I was just to copy and paste those in right here, what would happen is some of them would be male and some would be female, and we don't want that. So what I will do is very quickly highlight, select column G here, go ahead and come over to Filter, and I will just get rid of the blanks and the females, and it will filter my data so I have only males. Then I will go ahead and paste in my names there. If I scroll down, you can see it'll put in 100 of those names. And I still have some more names that I need to put in. So I'm going back to my website, Random Name Generator, and I'm going to do that one more time. And then I'll scroll down and collect those names and paste those in there. And if I come down to the bottom, one thing just to keep in mind, sometimes depending on how many names you choose, you might have more names than you need. So all of these names I don't need, so I'll just come down here and delete those names. So I've done that for the males. I'm going to go ahead and change this, get rid of the males and change it to females. And I'll do the same thing with female names. So if I go back to my Random Name Generator website, I'll change the male to female and click on Generate Random Names. Go ahead and copy these. Doing the same process, go back to my spreadsheet, paste those in, scroll all the way down to where that list has stopped. Repeat the process one more time. So I just click on Generate Random Names. Go ahead and get those names, paste those in, and then at the bottom of my list here, I will delete these names that I do not need. One last thing that I will do, because the font is a little bit different, I will just go ahead and readjust my fonts, reselect those so that it looks consistent. Let's take a look at teacher names, how to adjust teacher names. Teacher names are going to be a little bit different, and the reason is that different from student names, where each student name showed up just once. We had one unique student in each row. Here we have teachers that are attached to students, and a teacher has a class of students. So you can see, for example, Christopher Norton shows up 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, and more than once. So if I was to just generate random names, this would not keep the integrity of my data. So I'm going to do something to go ahead and pull this information here and then match it up. So there are a couple of steps that this is going to go through. The first thing I'm going to do is the same as before. I'll go ahead and insert a column to the right. I have a helper column, a helper tab. And in this helper tab, you can see that there's nothing there now. What I'm going to do is, in my sample data set, I actually want to get the teacher names. I want to find out all of the teacher names, and then I'm going to do something to replace those. So in my helper tab here, and it doesn't matter where you do this, this is just kind of a workspace. I'm going to type in the equals sign, and I'm going to type a formula called unique. And what the unique formula does is it will go and collect all of the values, the unique values within a range that you select. So if I come back to my sample data tab here, and if I just highlight all of column H, so you can see sample data set H to H, that's highlighting the whole thing, what it's going to do is it's going to look through all of those, and even if it sees Christopher Norton 2 or 3 or 4 times, it's only going to pull 1 for me. Okay? So if I just press return, you'll see here it just grabs all of the unique values from that column. Now what I can do is I can look here and I can see that I have down here my count 14. I have 14 teacher names. And I'm not really concerned with whether they're male teachers or female teachers at this point according to my data. I just need names. So I'll go back to my random name generator. And I will go ahead and select male and female. And I only need 15, so I'll just go ahead and pick 25. Click on Generate Random Names. And I'm going to come down and choose the number that I need. So I'll just choose 14. Copy those, heading back to my sample data set, and I'm just going to paste those in the column right next to the real data set there. So I have my names here. Now I need to create a formula to look up this information here, Christopher Norton, and replace it with this name Francis here. So the way that I do that is I create something called a VLOOKUP formula. So I'm going to type in equals VLOOKUP. And it's asking for a search key. So it's saying, well, what do you want us to look for? And I want you to look for the name Christopher Norton. I type in a comment and it says, okay, where do you want us to look for that? What's the range? So if I go back to my helper tab, I'm going to highlight this information here. So I want it to look here and I want it to return this. So I press comma, and then it says index, and index means within your range of your data, which column do you want it to return? Well, I have Christopher Norton, that's in the first column. The name I want to come back is in the second column. So I'm going to type in number 2, comma, and then I'm going to type the word false. And the word false means that I want an exact match. So if I press return, then that will show up. Now I could click and drag this down, and you'll see that some of it works just fine, like Jackie Quinn, Melvin Harvey, and Forrest Keller, Daryl Dean. But then I start to get these NAs. And what that means is that there's something wrong with my formula. So let's take a look at the formula real quick here, and then I'll show you how to fix it. So here I have my range A1 to B15, which is great. If I click on the next row, do you notice how this changes from A2 to B16? A3 to B17. So what's happening is, as our formula gets dragged down, our range is getting dragged down. So the second one was this range, and then it goes to this range. So anytime, if there's a name in that range, that's great, but if it's not, then it's not going to collect that. So we want to leave that range, and we don't want that range to move. So the way that we do that is by putting in keeping things called absolute values. So what I'm going to do is, in my formula here, in the helper, I'm going to type in a $, in front of the letter and in front of the number. And what that does is, as I drag a formula down, that range doesn't move. Okay, this H4 will move as we go down, which we want, but this range will not move. So if I go ahead and do that, now Google will give you this really cool feature that's fairly new. It's called autofill. So it recognizes formulas and it says, do you want us just to fill that in for you? And so if it's exactly what you want it to be, you go ahead and click on the check mark and yes, and it'll fill it in. Right now this looks like what we want it to look like, so I'll go ahead and click on the check mark. And it has filled in my formula for me, and it has all those teacher names going down, and so that's great. These two at the top were missing. That was my mistake. I started one row below, but that's not a problem. Just like when you put the cursor over the crosshairs here, and I can drag down. If you put the cursor over the crosshairs, you can actually also drag up. So I'll just drag that formula up. And if you do not get the autofill to show up, that's okay. Just put your cursor here over here and just drag the formula down and you will be in good shape. Another identifier that we need to take a look at is school names. So very similar to what I did with teacher names, I'm going to do the same thing with school names. So let's go back to our helper column, and I'll just pick another column here that I'm going to go ahead and put my formula in. I'm going to type in equals unique, and I will pick the range now that has the schools in it, and go ahead and press return, and I have my 3 schools there. So what I'm going to do is, if I have a list of schools that I want to replace that with, that's fine, but I'm going to go ahead and just type something in here. So I'm going to say elementary school 1. Now I can go ahead and do the same VLOOKUP formula that I did with our teacher names, and it will replace that. I'm going to show you one other thing that's a little bit more advanced, but you might find a use for it if you're copying and replacing formulas going down a single column. If I go back to my sample data set here, go ahead and insert a column to the right. What I can do is I come back into here, I'll go ahead and type in my VLOOKUP formula, and I know that I want my search key to be the school name. I know that I want my range to be schools here. Now, on a Mac, if you're on a Mac, if you press the down in the lower left-hand corner of your keyboard, the Fn key, function key, and then press the F4, it will go ahead and change those your range to be absolute values automatically. So that's kind of a neat shortcut. Press a comma there, and I want it to find column 2, and I want that to be an exact match. So I'm going to type false. Press return, and it go ahead and brings that in for me. And of course I can click drag down and all that kind of thing if I want. Another neat thing that you can do, a shortcut, is I like to use array formulas when I'm filling in formulas, and so that's just a slight adjustment to this. What I can do is I will come in here and I will type in array formula, and what an array formula does, it just kind of copies it down the whole row. And the only other difference that I need to do is I need to change, instead of just K2, I need to make it starting at K2 and going all the way down column K. Let's see what happens when I do this. So array formula VLOOKUP K2 to K, and if I press return, great, it fills that in for me. However, as I scroll down to the bottom of my data set, and I keep going, you can see that I have these in A values. Now I don't want these in A values. So this one, because we copied the formula all the way down, I can just delete these individually and they'll go away. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and highlight these for the teacher names and delete those. Now for my school name, if I click here and I try to delete it, it won't go away because I've created an array formula. However, we can fix that by taking our array formula, and we're going to wrap that in something called an if error. So if I type in if error, parentheses, this is saying, okay, this if error, what it's going to do is it's going to say, if there is no error, if everything is fine, then do all of this stuff. And then at the end, if I put a comma, it says, okay, well, what do you want it to do if there is an error? And what I want it to do is just leave this cell blank. And the way that we can do that is put double quotes, space, double quotes, and then I'll go ahead and close the parentheses. And now anytime that there is blank data, it won't give me an in A, it will actually just leave that blank. So you can see now those have gone away. So whenever I do a VLOOKUP inside of an array formula, I tend to also put an if-error statement. Let's take a look at email addresses. So I have some email addresses here, and I want to replace those with pretend email addresses. Now you can see that these are pretend email addresses already, but let's go ahead and I'll show you how to create new pretend email addresses, or the way that I do that. So I'm going to go ahead and click here for my students, insert a column to the right, and with this student here, what I basically do is I use a concatenate formula and I create a new email for this person. So the way I do that is I type in equals and concatenate, and it's saying, well, what do you want to concatenate? Basically takes columns of data and combines them into a single column. So let's take a look at how it does that. So I've already created a new student name. So the original name was Dana Sutton, and I've put in Ben Reyes here. So I'll go ahead and click on this cell. So I'm going to take the name Ben Reyes. And what else do I want to combine that with? Well, I want to combine Ben Reyes with the rest of the email. So I can put in a quote here, and it will just put in a string of text, whatever I want to put in. So I'm going to say at schoolemail.com, for example, and close quotes. And if I press return, then you'll see it does that. It combines the student's name with that string at schoolemail.com. And it's given me the auto suggestion, which is great. I'll go ahead and click on the check mark, and that will fill that in for me. And I do realize that there is a space there in between the names. So if you wanted to make it where there wasn't a space, you can do that with some other modifications. But because I know that this is just a example email, I don't really want anybody to be able to access it. So this is fine for me. Another identifier would be the date of birth. We want to make sure that we change that. However, when we change the dates, we want to make sure that if a student is in third grade and they're a certain age, we want them to be around the same age. So I'm going to show you one way that we can take this date and modify it a little bit, but just enough to where it's different, but it still could be a possible date for a student that age. So what we can do is go ahead and insert a column to the right, and we are going to use a formula called RANDBETWEEN. And what this does is it generates a random number between two values that we predetermine. So I'm going to type in my equal sign, and I'm going to say, go ahead and look at R2, and I want to add on a number to that. And so if I type in parentheses here, RANDBETWEEN, and then I give it two values, what I want my high value and my low value to be. So I'm just going to put my high value at, say, 5. I want it to be at least 5 days more than that date, and at max I want it to be 10 days more than that date. And I close my parentheses, press return, and it will give me a value. You can see it does the autofill here, which I will click on because that works. And so I can see here from July 12th changes to July 19th. That is March 6th changes to the 16th, etc., etc. So these are all worked for me. And these dates are similar to what they should be, but they're not exact. So that gets rid of that identifier. Now that we have our data for our demographics done, let's take a look at how we can create sample data for some test scores. So right now I have a spreadsheet here, a tab with my writing scores, and I've got some data in here that is still my original data, and I need to change that, but I still want to keep some of it the same, like these grade level pieces of information and stuff. So what I can do is I have my student ID number here, and I will go ahead and borrow that for a minute until I get all of my other information lined up, and then I can go ahead and get rid of this student ID tab and replace it. So what I'm going to do is, back in my sample data set, I want to replace the student ID, name, teacher. The grade level can stay the same. and then I'll replace the school as well. So in order to do that, I am going to insert a column to the right here, and I'm going to bring in new student ID numbers. So if you remember, we did our IFERROR, and then array formula, and then VLOOKUP. And I'm going to go ahead and look up these student ID numbers. So I'll click here, A2 to A. I want that whole range of that column there, comma. And where I want it to pick it up from is the sample data set. So I come into my sample data set, and I would like to pick the student ID, and then column B here is my new student ID that I created my sample data set. So I press comma, and I want it to return that sample data set. So I'll type in 2 because I want the second column, and false, double quotes to close in the VLOOKUP formula. And what I need it to do is, if it's an error, I want to go ahead and make sure that it remains a blank space. So I press quotes, space, double quotes, go ahead and close that. And now what that has done is brought in my sample data, student ID numbers there. Now that I have that, I can use a VLOOKUP formula to replace student names, teacher names, and school names, but still keep the integrity and keep everything linked together. Before I do that, I want to make sure that I keep this, my student ID numbers, the ones that I created, I want to make sure that they stay in there. Right now, this is a formula. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight all of these cells here with my student ID number, and I'm going to right click, and first of all, I'm going to copy that. I'm going to right click and paste values only. I can go ahead and get rid of my student ID number, and I will replace this. So now I have, I need to put in my student names, teachers, and schools, and I'll use a VLOOKUP formula for that. So same thing, I'm going to do equals IFERROR, array formula, VLOOKUP, and I'm looking up my student IDs here, and I want that range of the whole column A. And then I go to my sample data set, and I want it to look up from column B where my sample data student ID numbers are, and I've got student names. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just pull all the way over to here because I'm going to school. So I'm going to take that range, and I'm actually going to go ahead and press the function and F4 key to go ahead and lock that down. Press a comma, and the index that I'm going to find, well, let's see, what am I looking for? If I go back to my writing scores, I am looking for the teacher, the student name. So if I come back to my sample data set, the student name is in column C, but my range is from B to I, so it's in the second column there. So I'll press 2, false, and I got my double parentheses there, do a comma, and go ahead and put in my symbol for what to do if it's an error, and close that, and it'll bring in my student names. Now, the reason why I lock this down is because I don't want to have to type the whole formula, IFERROR array formula. I can just take that formula and I can use that for teacher and for school. So the first thing I need to do before doing that, let me go back into my formula here, and I need to lock down this range as well, so that when I drag the formula over, it will still look in column A for my student ID numbers. Now that I have that, I can take this and I can drag this over just like this, and it's still giving me student names. So what I need to do is I need to change the column here, this 2, I need to change it to the column that gives me the teacher names. So if I go back to my sample data set, from column B, that would be our first column, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. So that's our 6th column. So if I come into here, I'm going to change this number from a 2 to a 6, and now I have my teacher names. I'm going to go ahead and copy this formula here, Command C, come over to school, and do a Command V. And now I select the school. So 6 was for teacher, so let's go back to our sample data set. So this is 6, 7, and this would be 8. So I change this 6 to an 8. And I have my school names in. Now that I have my sample data set up, let's go ahead and take a look at test scores. So this is for Q1 writing scores, and maybe these are percentages. So I can use the RANDBETWEEN formula again to enter some scores. Now for a Q1, maybe a low might be like a 20, and a high might be, let's say, 80. And if I put that in, that's going to give me 61. Okay, that's fine. If I wanted to change this to a percentage, it's going to give me a really large percentage number, and that's not what we want. So what we can do instead is we can just adjust our RANDBETWEEN formula just a little bit by dividing this by 100. If we divide it by 100, then it gives us a decimal point. Now that we have that decimal point, when we go to change it to a percentage, it will look like a percentage that we are familiar with. Before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and drag my formula down. Now, since I have schools already here, I'm going to double click, and it will put the random scores in. Now for Q2, what I can do is I can take Q2, 3, and Q4. I can take the same formula, and what I'm going to do is drag it across the top in the top column here. Now for my Q2 scores, I might want to keep my random numbers the same, or I might want to change my percentages. Maybe in Q2 I had some students that might have gotten higher scores, and I only have low scores of maybe 30, for example. So I can do that, and it will go ahead and fill the formula in for me. So my scores are now all between 30 and 95. And Q3, maybe my students are doing a little bit better, and some are even getting 100. And maybe in Q4, they're doing really well, and the lowest score is a 70, and the highest score is a 100. And it'll give me those scores there. You can obviously adjust these as much as you want. If you decide that for Q3, you don't want anybody to have a 30, a score as low as 30, maybe the lowest score would be 50, then you can take that. But remember, these ones that auto-filled, they're still 30, so you would have to go ahead and drag that all the way down. Okay, so you could either drag it all the way down. If we go down to the bottom here, you'll notice that we have some scores that were auto-filled, and we don't want those. So if I hover over those, and I'm going to press Shift, Command, and the down arrow, and that will highlight all of that data, and then I can just delete it. And remember, anytime you adjust something on here, these scores will change. What I'm going to do first is change these to a percentage. So I highlight all of those columns, come up here and click on percent. It will change those to a percent. I can adjust the zeros by decreasing the decimal points. If I don't want these scores to change, if I like them how they are and I want to keep those, remember, you can highlight them all, which you already have now. I'm going to do a Command C to copy. Then I'm going to right click, paste special, paste values only, and now those scores will remain the same. They won't change. So I have my test scores for writing just like that. Let's take a look at another sample data set. This is of a MAP score, so an external assessment that I've pulled in from a CSV file, and these are scores that we would typically see from students of this age or this grade level. Now I have my student names here, my original student ID, and my student names here, so I need to make sure that I adjust this. So very similar to what I did with my writing scores, I'm going to go ahead and insert a column to the right, and I'm going to do my VLOOKUP formula again. So I'm going to do equals IFERROR array formula VLOOKUP, and remember my range is going to be in column A2 to A. I want that whole column. Type in a comma. I'll go back to my sample data set and I'll select columns A and B because my sample data set is in column B. Press a comma there, type 2 and type false. Put in my double parentheses, comma, and go ahead and put in my, if it's an error, what it needs to do is just create a space there. Now I have my student ID numbers in. I will go ahead and delete my student names and replace those with my sample data set. Before I do that, I'm going to highlight these, Command C, right click, paste special, paste values only. That way that doesn't change when I delete this column here. So let me type in my student ID number there. Now I can do my VLOOKUP formula again, equals IFERROR, array formula, VLOOKUP, get my student ID number, go back to my sample data set, and I want this time to get my ID number and the student name, comma, it's in the second column, false, close my quotes, put a comma in, go ahead and put in double quotes, space, double quotes, and now I have my student names in. So my sample data set is cleaned up. Now I can leave gender, I can leave grade level, that's all fine. And what we have here are scores, and we have it for the term fall 2020 to 2021. And this is great. If I scroll all the way down, we have all these scores for the fall term. Now, what if I wanted to show some growth in my sample data set? Well, I have one set of scores, but I want to have something that would resemble what would possibly be some scores that these students might get if they took the assessment again in the spring. So let me show you how I adjust this to keep the integrity of the data, but to show a sample data set with growth. What I do is I will come up and I will highlight all of my data here. And then I will copy this, so Command C. Then I'm just going to leave a blank row here just so you can see where the difference is. And I'm going to do Command V, and I've pasted all of that in. So right now it's exactly the same. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and change the fall scores to spring. Okay, so if I highlight this, and I'll go ahead and just delete that. So I'll just type in spring 2020 to 2021, press return, and I will copy this, Command C, and I will go ahead and scroll down till I get to the bottom of my data set here. I'm just going to paste that in. Now let's go ahead and take a look at these scores and make some adjustments so that we can show growth. So the first thing I'm going to do is I am going to delete these scores here because these are the exact same scores from the first set, from the fall set. So what I want to do is I want to create a number in here for Ben Reyes that is similar. If we go all the way up to Ben Reyes here, he has 208 for his writ language score. So we want a number that is close to 208, but within a reasonable range. So we're going to use a RANDBETWEEN formula that is nested inside of another RANDBETWEEN formula. So let me explain. So I'm going to type equals RANDBETWEEN. And what I want to do here, so my RANDBETWEEN, I'm going to get a low number and a high number. So let's take a look at what our low number should be. So our low number, we're going to create, I'm going to put another parentheses in here because I want this all to be nested within this. So I'm going to come all the way up and I'm going to say, give me a number that's 208 minus, now this is where I'm going to put in my other RANDBETWEEN. So I'm going to say that cell E2 minus RANDBETWEEN, a number that is between 1 and 10. 1 and 10 less than 208. Okay, that's my low number. Now let's take a look at doing the same thing for our high number. So if I do that, type in double parentheses to keep this all together. And I'm going to say, take a look at the number 208 again, E2. And now I want a bigger number. So I'm going to do plus RANDBETWEEN. And I will also want that to be a random number somewhere between 1 and 10 more than E2. And I'll go ahead and close my parentheses here. And I have a lot of parentheses. If I just press return, Google Sheets will recognize how many parentheses I need, and it will go ahead and adjust that for me automatically. So you can see it's assigned the score of 204. And so this student has actually had negative growth a little bit, 208, 204, but that is something that could be reasonable. Once I have this formula in, all that I need to do, instead of having to do this for every single one of them, all I need to do is drag this across, and it will look up in the appropriate row in E. You can see this has changed from E2 to F2, G2, H, I, and J. So those are going to match the numbers above, okay, for that student. Then what I can do is go ahead and just highlight those and put this over my crosshairs, double click, and it will fill in all of those numbers for me, just like that, okay? Now, this is great for most of our data. However, I want to highlight a couple of things here that you might notice. So if we go, for example, to this student here, Danielle Wolf, we'll notice that her writ language is 3 and 0 and then 216. And so these numbers look fine, but these don't seem to be right. There seems to be something a little bit off there. So let's take a look at why that is. So Danielle Wolf, this is in my spring data. Let me go back up to my fall data for Danielle Wolf. So if I come back up and I find Danielle Wolf, if I find Danielle Wolf here, we notice that there are no scores. So because of that, the RANDBETWEEN formula is looking at blanks, and they're just assigning numbers that are close to 0, okay? So what I can do instead is, for those values that I notice in my new data set, you might need to do this manually. You can come down here and you can then take a look at adjusting those scores manually. So like we'll just take a look at this student here, because it says here a 1 and a 9, and this is a 4th grader. So let's take a look at another 4th grader. We got 205, 220, 211, 215. So I could just go ahead and manually enter a number that is close to that. Same thing with my percentages. A 4th grader, 218.79, 218.89. Another 4th grader down here, 210.98. So perhaps I can, somewhere between 80s and 90s, I can assign a number. If you notice that some of that data was changing as I type stuff in because it's using the RANDBETWEEN, if you don't want that to happen, remember you can highlight all of your columns, copy those, right click, paste values only, and then those values shouldn't change anymore. Another thing to keep in mind when you're doing this is that some of your percent scores will be over 100. So if you want to keep those as high as possible, I would suggest you change those to 99s or 98 or something in the high 90s, okay? And so that is the way that you can adjust your map or external assessment data if you want to show growth and keep some data integrity going. So that's one way that you can do that. So I hope that you found this helpful. These tricks that I use to create sample data sets, some take a little bit more time than others depending on what you are trying to do. Hopefully you can apply these in some of your own work. Thanks for watching. You can find out more at smithvisualizations.com.